Hi. In today's lecture, I'm going to cover the origins of modern paleontology and some historical hoaxes that occurred along the way. The science of paleontology has evolved from the work of multiple individuals since the 15th and 16th centuries. However, there were Greek philosophers such as Anaximander, Empedocles, Herodotus, and others who wrote about the origin and nature of fossils. Some of these writings included discussions on the concept of very similar basic concepts of evolutionary theory, the organic nature of fossils, and the fact that fossils tell us how dynamic the Earth's surface is. These writings only touched on the surface of what the true nature of fossils are. For example, Herodotus thought that fossils in the limestone of the Great Pyramids were lentil beans dropped by the workers who were building them. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci pondered the presence of delicate shells on the top of some of the mountains that he liked to hike in. He reasoned that they could not have been placed there by the biblical flood because he saw much more robust shells, broken and weathered, on modern beaches. If a massive flood had transported these shells tens or hundreds of miles in a matter of days, then there was no way that they could have survived relatively unscathed. Instead, he postulated that the rocks were deposited when the area was covered by a shallow sea, long before the mountains were formed. What we know of as modern paleontology has its roots in the 17th century anatomist known as Nicholas Steno. Steno, as he's typically known towards geologists, worked as an anatomist for the Medici family, one of whom was the Grand Duke of Tuscany at the time. The Duke was pretty fond of Steno and allowed him to wander for days without contact. He would often go hike in the nearby mountains and make observations about the rocks that composed them. In the 7 years that Steno worked for the duchy, he wrote one of the most important texts in geological and paleontological history. His text was supposed to be a precursor to a much larger work, but that was never to be. In his Prodromus, as it is called, Steno pondered the nature of many things, including fossils. In 1666, a fishing vessel brought a large shark to the wharf. The Duke knew that Steno would be interested, so he had ordered that it be delivered to him. And it was so large that they only brought him the head, and upon dissecting it, which was one of Steno's specialties, he began to realize that the shark's teeth were very similar in shape and composition to local curiosities known as glossopetri, or tongue stones. The glossopetri were found in rocks in the surrounding region and were attributed to some, mythological properties. Steno, however, reasoned that the tongue stones were actually the remnants of a shark that were deposited in sediment that then became rock. This was the birth of modern comparative anatomy, geology, stratigraphy, and paleontology. Steno reasoned that the teeth must have been solid before the sediment because the sediment retained the form of the tooth, meaning that it had hardened around the tooth and that the tooth did not form within the solid rock, which had originally been solid. So this is important because other naturalists believe that fossils grew within rocks, pre-existing rocks, the same way that mineral crystals or veins do. We will discuss the importance of Steno's work in the lecture on geologic time. Not all historical works of science have been quite so successful as Steno's, though. Along the way, there have been many mistakes, some relatively famous hoaxes, some that you might not have heard of. The following recounting is an article titled "A Heavy Hoax," written by Alexandra Alvis for the Smithsonian, as read. At 27 years old, Berenger was named professor of the University of Würzburg in 1694. Only a year after achieving his doctorate in medicine there. In 1695, he was summarily appointed keeper of the botanical gardens of the university. In this period, medicine was heavily anchored in the botanical knowledge. The main components of most cures and salves were plant-based concoctions. Berenger was particularly enthralled by the natural history side of his career and passionately expanded his personal cabinet of curiosities to display his collection of interesting objects from the natural world. He also began to pepper his lectures with references to petrifactions, a catch-all term for what modern science now understands as fossilized remains of plants and animals. Berenger's rise through academia and academic ranks did not go unnoticed. J. Ignaz Roderick, a University of Würzburg professor of geography, algebra, and analysis, and George von Eckart, the university librarian, resented what they saw as Berenger's arrogance and plotted to deflate his ego. Aware of Berenger's fascination with fossils in the shell lime deposits of Mount Eibelstadt, and a local mountain, and his collecting practices, Roderick and Eckart formulated a plan to carve and plant fake fossils on the mountain. In 1725, they placed the first specimens and enlisted the assistance of Berenger's diggers, 3 boys that Berenger had hired to search the mountain for figured stones for his cabinets, although only one of the boys knew the full extent of the deception. And so their trap was laid. When the boys returned from the mountain with their first fake fossils, Berenger was thrilled. News of the fantastic stones spread, and the boys began receiving requests for their stone hunting abilities from local pharmacists, rich gentlemen, and even some of Berenger's fellow medical doctors. Berenger himself visited the mountain on several occasions and remarked on the fact that the hillside with which he had frequented and examined in the past but had never scrutinized very closely revealed a treasure. As the false stones continued to turn up, Berenger began to display them to his friends and colleagues, not all of whom were as certain of their veracity as he was. He writes that, to dispel these misgivings from their minds, I led some companions on the pleasant jaunt to the site where they dug out these portentous symbols of natural things with their own hands. Many of the fossils found on the mountain were genuine, which certainly contributed to Berenger's unwillingness to consider the possibility of the deception in the more whimsical examples. Although his cabinet no longer survives, Berenger's records show that it contained numerous specimens of these real fossils until Roderick and Eckhart began to surreptitiously contribute to his collection. He developed complex theories to explain the more fantastical items, the stones with writing, even with their occasional spelling and orthographical mistakes, were the work of God to ensure that when forgetful men grow silent, these mute stones might speak. They imagine the images of celestial activities such as shooting stars and radiant suns could be explained in reference to the Archimedean method of using a parabolic mirror to collect sunlight in a bowl in order to focus it to set fire on an enemy fleet. Berenger completed these theories and justifications along with engraving plates of the figured stones into a dissertation to be titled Lithographica Würzburgensis. As word reached Roderick and Eckhart that Berenger intended to publish on their hoax, it seemed that they felt a pang of guilt. They started a rumor that the stones had been false all along, and even sold some of them him directly, later informing him of how they were made. But Berenger put up no stock in their words, instead criticized the rumor and confession as an attempt to discredit him in chapter 12 of the Lithographica. The history does not record what catalyst finally changed Berenger's mind about how the origin of the stones occurred. The story passed down through the generations of scientists claims that in translating one of the Hebrew inscriptions, he discovered his own name after the publication of the Lithographica. Disgraced, Berenger immediately sought to recall and buy back the printed sheets distributed to the booksellers. Historical lore describes how his process bankrupted him, although there is no evidence of that. And indeed, he continued to work in the university setting after the publication. He subsequently brought a court case against Roderick and Eckhart and 3 diggers in 1726, and the stones were termed lying stones, or Lügenstein, was used in the case to describe the fraudulent fossils. In the course of the lawsuit, the boys were found not guilty, but the duplicity of Roderick and Eckhart was fully exposed. Berenger spent his remaining 13 years of his life on staff at the university, where he published 2 further books. But criticisms of his Lithographica had dogged his reputation as a scientist since, to the point that even his entry in the Dictionary of Scientific Biography is principally concerned with this mistake. Roderick and Eckhart suffered more immediate effects. Roderick was banished from Würzburg, and Eckhart was denied further access to the archives of the duchy. This dealt a crushing blow to his scholarship, much of which was left unfinished at the time of his death. So in that article, she describes the downfall of the concept of fossils as inorganic or as scripted figures of some divine origin. While the lesson from Berenger used to be much more catastrophic, that he died penniless in the streets trying to buy back all of his books. Indeed, what we see is the unethical behavior of Roderick and Eckhart is much more punished than the wrongdoing of academia that Berenger portrayed. So there have been many attempted forgeries and hoaxes since Berenger time. The most successful was that of the Piltdown Man. In the video in your lecture folder titled The Missing Link That Wasn't, from the PBS Eons series, is your next assigned viewing.